The atmosphere within the old stone church of Oak Haven, Pennsylvania, on that crisp autumn morning of October 27, 1953, was dense with the scent of damp soil and forgotten relics. It wasn't the familiar fragrance of beeswax and old hymns that usually filled the sanctuary. No, this was something far more ancient, far more intense, rising from beneath the very floorboards. Silas Croft, his back sore from years of farm labor and a recent flare-up of rheumatism, wiped a drop of sweat from his brow with a rough, weathered hand. Beside him, his nephew, Jedediah, a man half his age but with twice the restless impatience, grunted with exertion, forcing at a stubborn stone. "This is it, Uncle Silas," Jedediah declared, his voice echoing faintly in the cavernous, dust-filled space beneath the main altar. The last one. For weeks, the small congregation had been alive with the news. The old church, a respected structure dating back to the 1850s, was finally receiving its long-overdue renovation. The plans, carefully drafted by a young architect from Philadelphia, included a modern heating system, which meant gaining access to the long-forgotten basement. A space that, according to local law and faded church records, had been closed off for 70 years. Not simply locked, but sealed. A thick wall of mortared stone had been constructed, blocking the original entrance, and the only other access point, a heavy wooden trapdoor in the sacristy, had been fastened shut with iron spikes, then concealed by a new floor installed sometime in the early 1900s. Reverend Thorne, a man of calm demeanor and scholarly interest, had initially been doubtful. Perhaps it was just deemed unsafe, a structural issue, he'd suggested, looking over his spectacles at the yellowed blueprints. But the older members of the congregation, Silas among them, knew otherwise. There was a quiet reverence, almost a dread whenever the old basement was discussed, a shared memory passed down through generations of something disturbing. Now the moment of truth had come. The renovation crew, mostly local men, had spent days carefully removing the newer floorboards in the sacristy, exposing the ancient trapdoor. It was a formidable sight, made of thick oak and reinforced with rusted iron. The spikes driven deep into the surrounding beams had resisted every attempt to pull them free. Eventually, Jedediah, with his youthful power and a heavy crowbar, had managed to splinter the wood around them, weakening their hold. The air turned colder as the last spike ground loose. A wave of stale, earthy air, carrying a faint, almost undetectable odor, drifted upward. It was not the smell of decay, not precisely, but something reminiscent of forgotten earth, wet stone, and a trace of something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. It was a scent that irritated the back of the throat, a flavor of history. "Careful now, Jedediah," Silas warned, his voice rough with expectation. He felt a shudder pass through him, a feeling that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the pressure of 70 years of unasked questions bearing down. Jedediah braced himself, his muscles straining. With a final guttural cry, he pulled. The trapdoor, protesting with a long, drawn-out screech of stressed wood and corroded hinges, slowly began to rise. Dust, thick and ancient, billowed upward, catching the weak sunlight filtering through the sacristy window. It swirled in the air like a spectral veil, momentarily blocking their view. As the dust settled, a gaping black void was revealed. A set of rough-hewn stone steps, slick with what appeared to be constant moisture, descended into utter darkness. The air now flowing freely from below was noticeably cooler, carrying that same peculiar, unsettling odor, now stronger, more distinct. It was the smell of a place long left undisturbed, a crypt of lost time. Reverend Thorne, who had been watching from a careful distance, stepped forward, his expression a blend of apprehension and scholarly curiosity. He held a powerful battery-operated lantern, a modern device which he now switched on. A beam of bright artificial light cut through the gloom, piercing the swirling dust particles and illuminating the first few steps. "Well," the Reverend said, his voice scarcely a whisper. "It seems we've found it." Silas peered into the darkness, his eyes, though aged, still keen. He could discern the rough texture of the stone walls, the faint glimmer of moisture. The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets outside and the rhythmic drip of water somewhere deep within the newly opened space. It was a silence that conveyed much. A silence that had held its breath for 7 decades, waiting for this moment. Jedediah, ever the practical one, was already reaching for a coil of rope. Someone needs to go down there, uncle. See what's what. Silas nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the inky blackness. He felt a strange pull, a sense of duty. His grandfather had been a deacon in this very church, had lived through the time when the basement was sealed. He had always been reserved about it, a shadow crossing his face whenever the topic arose. Now Silas felt a generational burden, an obligation to finally uncover the truth that had been hidden for so long. "I go," Silas said, his voice steady, surprising even himself. "I'll go first." The Reverend hesitated. "Perhaps we should wait for daylight, Mr. Croft. Or at least have more men present." "No," Silas insisted, already beginning to descend the first slippery step. The cold seeped into his bones, a chill that felt older than the stones themselves. Some things are best faced without a crowd, and some secrets. They don't wait for the sun. As Silas disappeared into the darkness, the beam of Reverend Thorne's lantern following him, Jedediah and the others exchanged uneasy looks. The church, usually a place of comfort and light, now felt like a silent guardian holding a profound, unsettling secret. The 70 years of silence had finally been shattered, but what would rise from its depths remained to be seen. The very air seemed to pause, waiting for the past to finally disclose itself. The descent into the church basement was slow and measured. Each step Silas took echoed eerily in the confined area, magnified by the damp stone walls. The air grew heavier, colder, and the peculiar scent intensified, a mixture of mineral earth, stagnant water, and something else, something subtly organic, like dried leaves or very old timber. Reverend Thorne, holding the lantern high, followed closely, his breath misting in the frigid air. Jedediah, ever cautious, remained at the top, ready to assist with the rope. The beam of the lantern cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing a long, narrow chamber. The walls were rough-hewn filled stone mortared with a dark, almost black substance. The floor was packed earth, uneven and damp with patches of glistening moisture. There were no windows, no obvious ventilation, just the suffocating embrace of the earth. "It's larger than I imagined," Reverend Thorne whispered, his voice hushed with wonder and a hint of fear. Silas, now standing on the earthen floor, swept the lantern beam across the space. It was mostly empty, save for a few broken wooden crates scattered in one corner, their contents long since rotted away or removed. A rusted iron shovel leaned against the wall, its blade caked with dried mud. Cobwebs, thick and heavy, draped from the low ceiling like ancient veils, swaying almost imperceptibly in the disturbed air. "Looks like a storage room," Jedediah called down, his voice muffled. "Nothing much to see, uncle." But Silas felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't just a storage room. The way it had been sealed, the sheer effort involved, suggested something more. He ran his hand along the cold, rough stone of the wall. It felt solid, unyielding. As the lantern beam continued its slow sweep, it illuminated a section of the far wall. Unlike the rough-filled stone of the rest of the chamber, this part was smoother, made of cut blocks, and seemed to project slightly. It was almost as if a section had been built into the existing wall, or perhaps over something. "Hold the light steady, Reverend," Silas instructed, his voice low. He approached the anomaly, his boots crunching softly on the damp earth. The mortar between these cut stones was different, too, lighter in color, almost like a repair job. He pressed his palm against the cool stone. It felt solid, but there was a subtle difference in the resonance when he tapped it with his knuckles. A faint hollow sound. "There's something behind this," Silas murmured, more to himself than to the others. He traced the outline of the smoother section. It was roughly rectangular, about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. Too small for a door, too large for a simple niche. Reverend Thorne, his curiosity piqued, moved closer, shining the lantern directly onto the suspicious section. A false wall, perhaps, or a sealed-off alcove. Silas knelt, examining the base of the wall. The packed earth here seemed slightly disturbed, as if something had been dragged or pushed against it. He noticed a faint, almost invisible seam running vertically up the side of the smoother stone section, barely discernible beneath a thin layer of grime. "Jedediah, bring me that shovel," Silas called up. "And a pickaxe if you can find one." Jedediah quickly complied, lowering the tools on the rope. Silas took the shovel, carefully scraping away the loose earth at the base of the suspected false wall. He found no obvious cracks or openings, but the faint seam persisted. He then took the pickaxe, its heavy head feeling cold and solid in his hands. "Are you sure, Mr. Croft?" Reverend Thorne asked, a note of concern in his voice. "We don't want to damage the church's structure unnecessarily." "This isn't structural, Reverend," Silas replied, his gaze fixed on the wall. "This is a cover-up." He raised the pickaxe, its shadow dancing wildly on the wall in the lantern light. With a grunt, he brought it down, not with full force, but with a controlled strike, aiming for the mortar line of the seam. Tack, a shower of dust and small stone fragments flew. The sound was dull, not the sharp crack of solid stone, but a muffled thud, confirming his suspicion. The mortar, though old, was brittle. He struck again and again, widening the crack. The peculiar scent in the air seemed to thicken, becoming more pungent, more insistent. It was still not the smell of outright decay, but something akin to very old, dry wood, mixed with a faint sweetish undertone that was deeply unsettling. After several minutes of painstaking work, a small gap appeared. Silas dropped the pickaxe and knelt, peering into the narrow opening. The lantern light, directed by Reverend Thorne, streamed into the void. What they saw sent a shiver down Silas's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It wasn't another chamber, not yet. It was a small, dark recess, barely large enough for a man to stand in. And within that recess, tucked away in the deepest shadow, was a small wooden object. It was low to the ground, roughly carved, and seemed to be draped with something pale and tattered. "What is it?" Reverend Thorne breathed, his voice barely audible. Silas reached a trembling hand into the gap, his fingers brushing against the rough wood. It was a small, crudely built crib, and draped over its side, faded and brittle with age, was a tiny yellowed baby blanket. A profound silence descended upon the basement, heavier and more chilling than before. The implications were immediate, stark, and deeply disturbing. This was not a storage room. This was not a structural concern. This was a place where something, or someone, had been hidden, and the 70 years of silence suddenly felt less like a mystery and more like a deliberate act of concealment. Silas pulled his hand back, his face pale in the lantern light. He looked at Reverend Thorne, whose eyes were wide with dawning horror. The air, once merely cold, now felt heavy with unspoken grief, a palpable sorrow that had been trapped within these stone walls for generations. "Jedediah," Silas called up, his voice strained. "We are going to need more than a pickaxe. We need to get this wall down carefully." The younger man, sensing the shift in atmosphere, descended quickly. The discovery of the crib and blanket had transformed the mundane task of renovation into an archaeological excavation of a deeply personal, deeply tragic past. The church, a symbol of comfort and faith, had suddenly revealed a hidden, unsettling face, and the true nature of the 70-year secret was just beginning to unfold. The removal of the false wall was a slow, painstaking process. Silas, Jedediah, and Reverend Thorne worked in shifts, carefully prying away the stones, conscious of the fragile nature of what lay beyond. Each stone removed felt like peeling back a layer of time, revealing more of the heavy, stagnant air, and the unsettling scent that now seemed to cling to their clothes. As the opening widened, the small recess was fully revealed. It was indeed a cramped space, barely 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, carved directly into the earth and lined with rough-hewn planks of wood, long since warped and splintered by the damp. The crib, crude and small, stood against the back wall. Its wooden frame was dark with age, and the tattered blanket, once perhaps a soft white or pale yellow, was now a brittle, faded husk. Silas reached in first, his movements cautious. He gently lifted the blanket. Beneath it, the crib was empty. A wave of relief quickly followed by a deeper sense of dread washed over him. Empty, yes. But the presence of the crib itself was a chilling testament. Beside the crib, tucked into a corner, was a small wooden chest, no larger than a shoebox. It was plain, unadorned, and secured with a simple rusted iron latch. Silas carefully pulled it out. The wood was cold and damp to the touch, and a faint metallic smell emanated from it. "What's inside?" Jedediah whispered, his usual boisterousness replaced by a quiet solemnity. Reverend Thorne, his face etched with concern, nodded towards the chest. "We should open it here. Whatever secrets this place holds, they are part of this church's history." Silas carefully unlatched the chest. The rusted metal groaned, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the silent basement. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst layers of brittle yellowed cloth, were several items. The first was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. It was smooth to the touch, worn by countless caresses, and seemed to be made of a dark, polished wood. It was clearly a child's toy, a comfort object. Next, a small leather-bound book. Its cover faded and cracked. It looked like a journal, and beneath it, a stack of letters tied with a thin, brittle ribbon that crumbled to dust as Silas touched it. Finally, at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of linen, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was simple, unadorned, and felt surprisingly heavy in Silas's palm. He opened it with a delicate click. Inside, two faded daguerreotypes. One, a stern-faced man with kind eyes wearing a clerical collar. The other, a young woman, her expression gentle but tinged with a hint of sadness, holding what appeared to be a swaddled infant. The image was blurry, indistinct, but the implication was clear. "Reverend Caldwell," Silas murmured, recognizing the face from an old portrait in the church vestibule. "And a woman and a child." Reverend Thorne gasped softly. Elias Caldwell was the pastor here during the Great Winter of 1882 to 1883. He disappeared without a trace shortly after. It was always assumed he was lost in a blizzard or perhaps fell into the river during the spring thaw. The pieces began to click into place, forming a chilling mosaic: the sealed basement, the crib, the baby blanket, the child's toy, and now the locket with the pastor's image, and a woman with an infant. This was not just a secret. It was a tragedy carefully hidden away. Jedediah, who had been peering over Silas's shoulder, pointed to a small, almost invisible indentation on the wooden floor of the recess near where the crib had stood. "Look, Uncle, there's something else here." Silas leaned closer. The indentation was faint, a shallow groove in the old wood. He ran his finger along it. It felt like a worn path, as if something had been repeatedly dragged across it. He followed the groove with his eyes, and it led to a section of the wooden lining that seemed slightly looser than the rest. With careful effort, Silas managed to pry up the loose plank. Beneath it, nestled in the damp earth, was another smaller package. This one was wrapped in oilcloth, offering some protection from the moisture. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small wooden door, crudely carved, but with a distinct, almost haunting expression on its painted face. Its clothes, made of scraps of fabric, were tiny and delicate. And beside it, a single small leather-bound shoe, clearly belonging to an infant. The air in the recess grew heavy, thick with unspoken questions. The empty crib, the baby blanket, the child's toy, the locket.